thank you very much for having me. It's good to see many familiar faces. Am I going to go that way? No. I'm going to do that. It worked a minute ago. Yeah, we've tried the mouse. The mouse is not talking to me. Try the mat. Yeah, I tried it on the mat and the mouse is not talking to me. Yay. Okay, I need a bit more strength. Okay. So I think my major aim for this session is to make sure that when I finish, you're no more asleep than now, so the rest of the afternoon will be a successful engagement for you. So as Karen said, my name is, my role is CEO of Noah's Ark. What I'm going to talk to you about though is really work that I've done in relation to national things. So I'm an ex-national president of ECIA, and I led work on a joint statement on inclusion, which will be part of what I talk about, and also co-convened a conference called Reimagining Inclusion. So basically the structure, if I can get, oops, now I've gone too far. End show, previous. So the structure of, I was really nervous about the technology and now I know why. The structure of what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about context in terms of children with disability and early childhood education and care. I'm going to talk about the joint statement, Reimagining Inclusion, and then think of some of the opportunities which come out of that. It's quite fun following on my former colleague, Val Johnson. This is going to be death by PowerPoint compared to Val's conversational side. So if you are thinking about this, so it's going to be fairly high level in terms of structures. And I think the thing to think about in terms of this is that when practitioners go into a service to talk to somebody, we usually just accept that that's how it is. But actually, the education and training that people come into that setting, the attitudes and beliefs that people come into that setting with, and the ease or complexity of all the supports that will be there or be difficult to find, they're actually all social constructions. We've actually designed or not designed that system. And so part of this discussion is, well, how do we keep actually thinking about supporting practitioners and educators as they meet to do this work? Okay, where am I? So in terms of Australia, we've got some great news in terms of recent developments. We've had major reforms in terms of early childhood education and care. And that's led to a national quality framework, universal 4-year-old program for children, and particularly, I think importantly for us, the development of an early years learning framework and the set of outcomes for all children. And then in the disability space, we've got the National Disability Strategy and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So while we're grappling with the complexities and the to's and fro's of government, these issues are actually very central to agendas, which is something that hasn't happened for a very long time. So the reality check, I'm just going to have to keep checking myself. The reality check is that what we're actually faced with across the country is children have vastly different experiences, or families have vastly different experiences. We have, and even in Victoria, you have vastly different experiences. The resources are inconsistent, they're limited. We don't have a Bill of Rights, and the consequence of that is that the actual legal defences and protections for children are quite weak. And while we have anti-discrimination legislation, there's very little activity which is actually undertaken through that because of the difficulty of actually working with it and the timeliness. We don't have a history of professional development. We don't have a lot of work done in terms of preparing educators for children with disabilities or early childhood intervention staff to work with educators. There's a lack of data. We know very little about who's out there doing what. And Australia historically is rated very low by the OECD in terms of the resources that it puts into early childhood. So while it's good that it's on the agenda, let's not have any illusions about how much is actually in that service system. So the opportunity then is that we've got this interest in terms of a potential convergence between what's happening in early childhood education and care in terms of the early years learning framework, and within the National Quality Framework, a real commitment to all children being part of that system, a much stronger commitment that's existed before. So there's an interest from a policy point of view at that level of having children with disabilities really actively involved. And then from a early childhood intervention level, we're really interested in terms of working in natural environments. And in some ways, I think for the natural environments project to really deliver what we're hoping it will deliver, it's really essential that children do have the opportunity for meaningful participation and to learn and develop in early childhood services. So the context that we're in is a history of deinstitutionalisation. And I think one of the things that we don't pay enough attention to is the fact that we're in a very early stage in terms of the evolution of what we're doing. The earliest services that we have in terms of the earliest community services that we have for children with disabilities following the institutionalisation process. So up until the 60s and 70s, which isn't that very long ago, children with disabilities are segregated from the community. They're separated from the community. What's interesting is that that's also the time when lots of the work is being done in terms about developing early childhood education and care services. So those services originally are thought about in a way which doesn't include children with disabilities, because children with disabilities simply weren't there to think about. When we started our first early childhood intervention services, or early intervention services as they were in the 70s, they were still segregated services. There were a lot of issues still to be dealt with in terms of attitudes in the community, how we supported children and those sorts of things, which were really being worked out in that period. There wasn't necessarily any reason for there to be a strong relationship between the people working in early intervention and the people working in the early childhood services. So that relationship is actually quite a recent development. And we've come out of a model which was fairly basic, I think, in terms of what we did initially was that we attached an additional assistant to a child to make sure that they fitted in or didn't interrupt programs in early childhood services. In the first version of that in Victoria, the parents actually employed the additional assistants. In the second version, it moved into kindergartens employing them, and then it's only since the 90s that we've had clusters of additional assistants working. Now, the reason why I mention that it seems old history in some ways, but it's interesting looking at the kinds of reports which are still being done, and this one is, yes, it's being done around education, and it's saying that there are still major barriers to children with disabilities because that origin in terms of having very low expectations is still coming through in some situations, and that we still rely largely on unskilled staff a lot of the time, or less skilled staff in terms of providing support. So I think the other thing to say about our whole system is it's been incredibly fragmented. So we're actually quite fragmented as a field, and that's a discussion for another day. But services have really developed up trying to do the best they can without a lot of overview or coordinated approach. The Australian government services haven't necessarily fitted in to where the state services have been. So and then there have been other inclusion professionals. So overall, and you can see it now, we have a confused way of working which has really evolved over time rather than being designed. And it's interesting, again, if you think about that in terms of the broad disability world, well, it's just very characteristic. So what we've been working through is we started off with people with disabilities generally out of the community. We're still working out how do we actually meaningfully have them as part of our community. So I wanted to use that as a background to the development of this position statement, which I hope people are all familiar with. To my memory, we've only got two position statements. ECIA has two position statements, one which was done in about 2005, which was called Starting with the End in Mind, which was a position statement done by the Victorian field, in which, in terms of this topic, we actually agreed that our goals included participation. And I think that was a central thing to that goal, that we wanted to, it wasn't just about developing children's functional skills, it was also about them participating more broadly. The second thing was that it very clearly identified a role for early childhood intervention in the community. This second statement was the first time that the early childhood education and care field and the early intervention fields had actually sat down to try and negotiate how do these two fields work. So we're now, if we go back to 70s, that was we're about 40 years into this process before the peak bodies are actually sitting down and saying, well, we really need to look at how our two fields can build support for each other together as we look at a way forward together. I think that the fact that we had the early years learning framework was very critical because there was something that we could work around. That national statement was developed through a national process. So there were what we called listening sessions in each state and territory. So a project worker went round and listened to what people were saying everywhere. We collated that. We looked at a questionnaire which went online. I think we had something like 1,500 responses from practitioners, parents, and other interested parties. From that, the statement started to be formed, and then various drafts went to each of the early childhood intervention chapters and also the Early Childhood Australia chapters. So this was a long process which went over about 12 months of doing this collective thinking. And the statement which we arrived with has three parts. One is about rights. So it was really talking about that children with disabilities have the same rights as other children. So that was felt that it was still a very strong, important message to be putting out. The next issue was about access and participation. And this started to borrow from the language of the early years learning framework. But it also picked up the fact that engaging with families was a central part of being successful in inclusion. And the third part was looking at resources and the fact that this isn't going to happen by magic, even though we might like it to believe it would. So those were the three parts of that statement, and it also included a range of ways in which the early childhood intervention and the early childhood service, the early childhood education and care people could work together, and I'll come back to where we are with those a bit later on. But we then decided to push this even further with what we called a Reimagining Inclusion Conference, which was co-convened by Noah's Ark and the Centre for Community Child Health. So what we did was we systematically invited people nationally from all of the stakeholder groups who have an interest in inclusion. So one of the things, so we basically, with the joint statement, we'd got two of the stakeholders to come to an agreement. We then realised that there were a whole lot more stakeholders who weren't part of that discussion, but who ultimately had influence over what we were going to be able to do. And they included, as well as the educators, people like the universities and the training bodies who were preparing staff in both fields, the government policy makers. So it was a broad and eclectic mix of people that we brought together. We basically saw the purpose of the conference was to start a conversation, and we knew that the more people who were basically on the same page, the better, because we could support each other's work, and we weren't necessarily good at doing that up to this point. The challenges were, oops, no, I've jumped again. The challenges were that we actually didn't know this was going to work. So we were basically inviting people from around the country, and if the people who are now looking at the National Disability Insurance Scheme are discovering this, we all do things incredibly differently in each state and territory. So in inviting everybody around the table, we knew we were going to be dealing with people who used language in different ways. There was potential that they were all going to compete with each other, and we weren't going to find common ground. So we were actually quite nervous about how this project was going to go. So what we did was we created a particular kind of meeting process in terms of how we got people to work. We ended up with 67 partners, and we call partners people who came from each of the stakeholder groups. And we combined two styles of meeting. One style was a traditional people talking, and then another style, we borrowed a methodology of what's called a search conference. And the search conference approach is really interesting in the sense that what it's doing is basically looking at how do you build a dialogue between people who don't normally get together and talk about issues. The traditional conventional conference methodology we wanted to use because we wanted to build up some common language amongst people. So when we did the joint statement, the statement in Victoria back in 2005, that took us 14 months to do in terms of building a common language between each of our agencies in Victoria. When we started, it was like the Tower of Babel. Everybody was often talking about the same thing, but using different words. So it took about that long for people to actually build that commonality. So we were really doing a sort of an attempt at speed dating, if you like, with this process, where we were trying to bring people together much more quickly. So we went through a process where we had a group of international speakers who talked about the evidence, and then at the end of each day we brought the partners together for a couple of hours to start a process of thinking through where we are, where we might go to, and some of the challenges in that and what the vision for the future might be. We ended up also with a group of cross-sector working groups to take some issues forward. So what did people talk about? They talked about, I'm just finding out how long I've taken to this point. Good. They talked about 4 things. The conversation was around the quality of early childhood education and care. Then there was a conversation around, which crudely grouped around attitudes and beliefs, around service fragmentation, and then what I'm going to call service design. So how do we do things? The conversation around the quality of early childhood education and care, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a conversation which says, well, what's the capacity of early childhood education and care programs in terms of working with children with disabilities, and what are the structural issues for them in terms of whether the workforce are suitably recognised, suitably paid in terms of childcare, what kind of training they have, what their backgrounds are. And again, one of the fundamentals in the notion of working in natural environments is that the theory is that children are learning from people they have long-term relationships with. And if the staff in early childhood education and care is really unstable, then that's not going to be very helpful. In terms of the attitudes and beliefs, again, these things would probably be predictable to you. A sense of greater belonging for families, so a sense that families still didn't always feel that they were being welcomed or included. That community attitudes were often not always supportive, so other parents may not be supportive of children with disabilities being included. That parents in our processes around inclusion are very powerless, that they aren't equipped with information to be particularly good advocates. And then there was a role in terms of government and other peak bodies in terms of much stronger advocacy in this area. The conversation, so this runs parallel to the conversations which went through when we were developing the joint statement. And the conversation there was that, well, we've got very positive attitudes, but it's still aspirational in terms of how broadly those are shared. That we're moving, the debate over the last 20 years has moved to one from access, where the question was, well, should the child actually come into the centre? And we haven't always solved that. But the debate is moving on to one which is much more around access and participation, but they're more complex things to think about. The Early Years Learning Framework is a fantastic opportunity. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the early childhood intervention field finally comes to terms with and embraces that. And finally, which I found really interesting, was just the close relationship between poor implementation and negative attitudes. So people were saying, well, where staff are really well supported in this process, then it's more likely that they'll move to positive attitudes. And the reverse is the case. If they feel under-supported, then they'll either stay negative or move more negative. So then in terms of service fragmentation, again, lots of conversations just about how different the opportunities, how variable the situations are. So we have great success stories, but then we have great failure stories. We don't seem to have got to the point where we're able to do this very consistently. Across our services, there is a lack of coordination, and we still work in silos, and I would say we still don't work. For example, the Commonwealth programs and the state programs still have a way to go in terms of how well they work together in general. We don't have good flows of information between the early childhood education and care field and the early intervention field, and so forth. The same sorts of issues came out of the joint statement process, so optimism around what the early years learning framework could offer, but also the observation that we see the clustering of children in particular services who are seen to do a good job, and other services not getting involved as much. The issue of service design, I think, is really interesting. So service design is, well, how do we organise ourselves? And I think we're very clear about what we would like, particularly from an early childhood intervention field. And a lot of the conversation about inclusion comes out of early childhood intervention because we see the benefits of children being included. It's less clear that conversation is coming back equally from the educators, from the early childhood educators field. One of the things which came through in the kinds of comments that came out of the joint statement was still this commitment to AIDS as the solution to the problem. And I think this fundamental question of how do we shift from having somebody looking after a child with a disability to having a program which includes all children. We're somewhere 20 years on in that process, but we still haven't quite got it right consistently everywhere as well. And part of that issue people kept coming back to was a lack of training for both the early childhood intervention field in terms of how it works in early childhood education and care settings, and then for educators about how they might best work with early childhood intervention staff. So, by way of conclusion, what is clear is that where we end up in inclusion is going to be influenced by all of these different stakeholders. So it's not just going to be what we think or even the educators think, it's also related to what the parents believe, what the training and education facilities are prepared to offer, and what the policy makers are going to do. So in terms of aligning all of those things, and particularly at a national level, there's an enormous amount to do. In terms of attitudes and beliefs, then we need to go back and keep thinking about how we build community support. So one of, I think, the interesting questions as we go into the National Disability Insurance Scheme is there is work which has been done through various services which has actually been around community building, community attitudes, and how do those sorts of things carry on in a different kind of service model. The bigger issue is probably that what's emerging, particularly in the work that's being done in the US, is that the real change process in this is coming through different approaches and different skill bases in the early childhood services themselves. So there's a lot of work being done in what some people are calling blended practices, but basically looking at how do you translate the skills that people have from the early intervention field, from special education, how do you take those and make those skills available to people working in childcare and kindergarten? And unless we can work out how to do that, then we are going to be limited in terms of how we can consistently do that. And I know there have always been good staff who do that naturally, but we need to be better than relying on individuals in terms of doing those sorts of things. One of the things in terms of the preparation of staff is really in terms of also thinking about, so this is going through the same sorts of things. What I did want to also just focus on is just clarity of role. So one of the things I think that we're yet to get really clear from an early childhood intervention perspective is what is our role as we go and visit early childhood services. If you talk to educators, they will tell you that they've got lots of people coming in with competing priorities. So lots of people come and give advice, but they're giving advice in different ways about different things. And so we're still making life more complicated as a result of that. Where we got to with the Reimagining Inclusion Conference was that we actually set up a series of working groups. One of the things which has been most successful is the much stronger policy cooperation between Early Childhood Intervention Australia and Early Childhood Australia. So people have realised the value, the importance of, from an early childhood intervention point of view, the value or the importance of high quality services for children. So there's been much more interest in the current Productivity Commission process, for example, from early childhood intervention than there was in the past. There's also been much more interest in terms of Early Childhood Australia in terms of looking at specifically what are the implications of changes for children with disabilities. Another group is working on role clarification. So one of the most fascinating conversations I sat in at this conference was some New South Welsh early intervention people talking to people who worked in the inclusion and professional support program and actually starting a conversation, well what exactly is your role? So that was the conversation that they needed to have. We've got work happening in terms of clarification of language. Probably the biggest issue that we still don't have resources for is around dissemination. So how do we get information out about practices? How do we get information out about changes? So I think the National Disability Insurance Scheme is both a huge opportunity and a huge challenge in terms of where do we go with these sorts of issues. There's clearly an interest in terms of working in natural environments, in terms of the transdisciplinary model. There's also interests about demarcation in terms of, well, what's education, what's National Disability Insurance Scheme. So I think whether we get those sorts of things right is going to be critical in the next period in terms of whether we're moving in a positive direction or whether we're actually creating more barriers to this process. I think the review of childcare and early learning, the Productivity Commission review, which has just come through, clearly didn't understand children with disabilities at all. They came up with a series of recommendations which I described as basically a widget solution. So, if you don't understand what you're dealing with, then you adopt a process where they just divided everybody up and gave them a little bit of money and said, well, they'll all come back and put it together. I feel comfortable saying this to you because I said it to them pretty much. The encouraging thing was that they actually acknowledged that this was the part that they'd found the hardest in terms of working through, and I know they've been doing a lot of work, so hopefully we will get more progress as we go ahead. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. The last thing, one thing I did want to mention, which I think is a really fantastic story though, I went up and spoke to the educators, the people from the department up in ACT in the middle of the year, and they said that conference was just so fantastic because they'd had exposure to a whole lot of things which they hadn't previously had, and they basically said they'd spent the whole time, a couple of them had come down going, oh my God, to each other, do we really do that? What they've been doing is basically running segregated classroom settings for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. The timing was auspicious in the sense that the National Disability Insurance Agency is setting up its trial at the same time, but basically all those services are now closing down. So they really are looking at a way where children aren't kept segregated basically through their early childhood experience, which I think is a fantastic conclusion. And I know I'm now out of time, but so I'll thank you all.